Good morning, folks. This is Jason Powsey with DPS. Welcome, everybody. The purpose of the conference today is to discuss the electric utility's existing transmission and distribution planning process and the changes to that process that were proposed in the Coordinated Grid Planning Process filing on December 17th, 2021 by the JU. We consider today's meeting to be an informational and educational effort and encourage stakeholders to ask questions of the JU. However, keep in mind that we are only in the beginning of this overall stakeholder process, and there will be more opportunities for comments and feedback in the near future. I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items first. We will be placing everybody on mute except for the speakers. So please continue to stay on mute unless you are asking a question. As you had heard before, this WebEx is being recorded, and we'll be placing that recording on the DPS website along with the presentations and the slides for today. The website link is on the notice for this case. Again, this case is 20-E-0197. And again, the link for the website is down here on a notice. The presentation will be broken down into a distribution planning section and a transmission planning section. We'll be having approximately a 20 to 30 minute question and answer session after each part of the presentation by the JU. We ask people to put together their questions and write them in the chat, as we'll go through them accordingly after each of the separate sections from the JU. We will also offer those on the phone who couldn't actually join the WebEx the opportunity to ask questions as well after that. So overall, we're going to be going through the distribution section first. We'll have a Q&A session. We'll be going through the chat box to ask those questions of the JU, and then as well, if there are people on the phone after that, we can respond to them accordingly. And then we'll continue with the transmission part, follow up with Q&A, and then wrap up sometime around noon or 12:30. I think we have plenty of time for a good Q&A session. And again, we definitely encourage questions from the stakeholders. Are there any questions from people on the phone at this time as far as the process before we get started? Hearing none. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John Borchert from Central Hudson, as I believe he will be leading the JU distribution planning part to start off with. John?
Thank you, Jason. And then thank you, Chris, for sharing the slides. Good morning, and welcome to the first in a series of stakeholder sessions to help inform the coordinated grid planning process for local transmission and distribution planning to meet the CLCPA. My name is John Borchert, Senior Director of Energy Policy and Transmission Development at Central Hudson, and I'm here with Chris Schramm, the Senior Engineer in Strategic Planning at Avangrid, representing the joint utilities in a high-level discussion of the current transmission and distribution planning practices. Next slide. Today's session is twofold. First, to level set on the existing planning practices for distribution planning, local and bulk transmission planning, and then to discuss some of the changes needed to more proactively meet the requirements of the CLCPA by more directly addressing the issues of headroom and congestion of clean resources. Next slide. As a background, this work is being prompted by the CLCPA and its goal to have the electric system supply be 100% clean by 2040. As a follow-on to the CLCPA, the Accelerated Renewables Act initiated changes to the utility T&D planning processes, specifically aimed at improving our local T&D planning process and identifying investments needed to meet the CLCPA. Next slide, please. The existing planning processes are designed to meet the mandates from regulators such as NERC, NPCC, the New York State Reliability Council, as well as to be in compliance with internal planning criteria. The utilities have an obligation to plan and operate their networks in accordance with national, statewide, and local reliability criteria. The goal of the Coordinated Grid Planning Process, or Cgpp, is to identify cost-effective system upgrades that are not driven by reliability standards, but would help New York State meet the CLCPA and Accelerated Renewables Act's goals. It is critical that the Cgpp maintains consistency with existing methods and models so that providing safe and reliable power to New Yorkers is not jeopardized. The utility Cgpp framework applies these reliability planning criteria to assess renewable energy deliverability constraints and develop sound solutions. Next slide. The level set for today's discussion and for future discussions, there are the systems as we define them are bulk, which covers from the generating stations to the load stations with voltages typically greater than 100,000 volts, 100 kV. The local transmission system is for transmission and substation typically below 100 kV. And the distribution system goes from the local transmission system down substations to the customers. And although we've defined these sections based on these like broad facility definitions, there's quite a bit of overlap in the planning processes. For instance, the bulk transmission planning process uses local transmission plans to inform the base case as well as future planning studies. The local transmission plan uses information from both the bulk system plan as well as from the distribution system to develop its plans, and so on. The Cgpp is focused on the local transmission and distribution systems across New York State, with consideration and incorporation of the bulk transmission plans. Next slide. So with that overview, we're now going to move into the planning sections, starting with an overview of the distribution system planning and practices. And again, my name is John Borchert, Central Hudson Senior Director of Energy Policy and Transmission Development. And my role at Central Hudson is varied, but one main focus is the development of Central Hudson's Distributed System Implementation Plan, or DSIP, and the various pieces that make up our plan, including much of what we will cover here today. Next slide. This is a discussion on the planning process, not the interconnection process. The focus here is to look, is how we look at our distribution system, the customer's needs, including DER, the identification of system needs, and the development of solutions. The interconnection process, whether it's the New York SERB process, New York State SERB process, the utility process, or the NYISO process, while similar to the planning process, has a different focus, which is the interconnection of distributed energy resources to the grid and assessing the impacts of each DER interconnection on the grid. This part of the session will cover distribution system basics, planning goals, the process, inputs, identification of needs, identification of solutions, and the integration with other system plans. Next slide, please. The distribution system is defined as the system between our transmission and the customer. It includes substations, power transformers, and circuits or feeders. In New York, the distribution system is primarily a radial system, often with normally open tie points. It is designed to operate within thermal limits and voltage limits, and is typically designed to what we'll call an N-0 reliability, meaning that a single element out on the distribution system can result in a customer outage. Some areas have a more robust design and reliability criteria, typically based on customer concentration. The distribution system is inherently different than the transmission system, and therefore uses different planning models and processes. Next slide. Here are two illustrations showing some different types of distribution systems. Although the radial distribution system, the diagram there shows the entire system from the generator to the customer to be radial, we know that that's not the case. The reality is the transmission systems, whether it's bulk or local, are highly networked systems that operate with redundancy. The radial distribution system is not networked, and while often will have the ability to backfeed through tie points, these are normally open tie points. There are, however, network distribution systems. A large part of our New York system is network distribution systems, but these are networks that are fed by either multiple feeders and also maybe multiple transformers. These are typically in larger urban areas such as New York City and are highly reliable, but can be more expensive and far more complicated to operate. Next slide, please. The goal of the distribution planning process is to ensure the long-term adequacy, stability, and strength of the distribution system to deliver electricity in a safe and reliable and affordable manner. That's the general overarching goal of our distribution planning process. Next slide. The distribution planning process is done on an annual basis. There are forecasts and other inputs. The forecasts and other inputs are updated on a periodic basis for use in the reliability or infrastructure, and to identify solutions to address these needs. The output of the distribution planning process is the system plan and the capital forecast. Next slide, please. Forecasts are one of the most important and can be the most controversial inputs into the planning models. Many of the distribution utilities through the planning process will use both a top-down or system-wide forecasting approach based on econometric models, and then a bottom-up approach based on historic circuit trends and more granular information. These forecasts are done on a 5 to 10 year basis. Weather normalization as well as weather probabilities are used in these forecasts. The forecasts of DER, such as electric vehicles, solar, storage, and energy efficiency, are performed separately. And methods such as forecast scenarios are used to reflect variability. The impacts of known large loads, or DER and Q, are also added to the granular forecasts. The forecast ultimately provides load, growth, and rates to identify substation and circuit load serving capability and potential needs. Next slide, please. Another input into the planning process is the condition assessment, typically driven by inspections. These can inform when system replacements need to be done and can help determine which solutions may be more appropriate. Other programs such as grid modernization or even transmission plans will also be an input into the distribution planning process when selecting potential solutions. Next slide. Another input into the distribution planning process is the assessment of reliability performance on the system. The number of outages on a circuit or section of the system, the duration of outages, and finally improvements to the system that are planned or being made to improve resiliency. These all will weigh into the selection of projects and the selection of solutions. Next slide, please. Distributed energy resources are forecast separately from loads, but then they're combined with the loads to assess the impacts on the distribution system. Information from the NISO or CERQ are used to inform the locations of DER on the system. And aside from the interconnection process, the projected DER in Q or forecasting may result in system needs such as transformer or substation upgrades. Next slide. These inputs are combined into system studies. These studies are used to refine the area needs and the timing of these needs. Once the needs and timing are established, the planning process turns to solutions, looking at both short-term and long-term solutions. In many instances, low-cost solutions, such as load transfers from one circuit to another or one station to another, can work, better matching system capacity to expected load or generation. If these low-cost solutions are not sufficient or will not work, there are additional factors there's additional factors that could make a low-cost solution less desirable. A longer-term or traditional solution will be developed. Sometimes multiple solutions can be developed to be compared as alternatives. For any of these solutions, a screening for a non-wires alternative will be done to see if the project is a suitable candidate for a non-wire solution. One key step in the process to ensure that the project and project timing is to ensure that the project and project timing is aligned with local transmission plans. For example, if the solution is a new station or transformer, ensuring that the new station or transformer considers near-term or long-term transmission upgrades would be essential. Lastly, a BCA or alternatives analysis is performed to help select the most effective least cost solution to meet the distribution system needs. Next slide. Once the final set of solutions are determined, projects are identified and prioritized. Multi-value projects are typically given higher priority due to their ability to solve a number of issues, such as improving reliability, operational flexibility, or improving hosting capacity. Solutions and recommendations are incorporated into the annual capital plan and forecasts, which is a 5-year capital forecast. In addition, at Central Hudson, we include these project details along with the local transmission projects in our long-range system plan, which we've published along with our DSIP filings. As an example of the distribution planning process and how it has worked in the past, The distribution planning process takes the forecasted scenarios and applies them to the system to assess the system's capability to serve load. And when a planning study shows the need for a system upgrade due to load or firm DER, the need is further assessed for its ability to serve future load or future DER. In this particular example, Central Hudson's Coxsackie substation was identified as an area needed for an upgrade. The area load required a new transformer to be installed, which would have been 13.4 MVA. While this was adequate for the expected load and future load, and for the firm DER that was interconnected or to be interconnected in the area, the area had a large amount of DER and Q. The planning process recognized that it was much less expensive to increase the transformer size than to add additional transformer or change the transformer later. In this instance, which was done prior to the cost share 2.0 process that is in place today, the DER developer paid the nominal amount for a larger transformer to help him interconnect in the future and improve hosting capacity at the Coxsackie substation. Next slide, please. One aspect of distribution planning is the transformation to a smarter grid. Many distribution projects will have ties to these efforts, whether it's adding devices to the system for increased visibility or improving circuits for operational flexibility. One large part of this effort is providing system redundancy for improved operational flexibility by building circuit backbones, adding tie points, and adding system automation. A large benefit of these projects is the inherent increase in hosting capacity while a circuit is being reinforced. But more so is the upcoming capability to be able to operate the system to higher levels of DER penetration, either through flexible interconnection or the dispatching of DER through future DERMS systems. Next slide, please. In the past, it was felt that planning and operations of T&D systems were completely separate activities with little or no integration. That the distribution planning engineers would provide forecasts to the forecasted bus loads to the transmission planners, and distribution planning always assumed that the transmission system was an infinite bus. Today, we know that that is not the case, and the distribution planning is much more aligned with local transmission plans, ensuring that common and distributed forecasts of load and DER are used, and that the area studies align distribution solutions and transmission solutions to ensure that the most effective combined solutions are selected. Next slide. If there are a few takeaways I'd like you to have from this presentation, it's that distribution planning efforts in the utilities are aligned with transmission planning efforts through the use of common forecast, common needs assessments, and integrated solutions. However, this alignment does not have to take the form of an integrated holistic process or analysis or model. Distribution systems, based on their design, have their own planning processes and their own planning models, which are different than those necessary and used for transmission planning. Distribution systems have their own characteristics, which make their system needs and solutions much more locational in nature than a transmission plan or model. Distribution solutions are typically much more nimble making it possible to delay the need to pull the trigger. And the solutions can be as simple as transferring load from circuits or substations to resolve load or hosting capacity issues. With that being said, we will need to continue to evolve our distribution planning processes to more proactively address the needs identified in meeting the CLCPA. Next slide. So, thank you for your attention. And at this time, we will take questions related to this review. And I did say we because if there's questions that I can't answer, there's a lot of joint utility folks on the line, and I will call a friend. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you, John. So what we're gonna do is go through the chat box first, and then we can open it up from there. So the first question in the chat box is from Danny Wagner, and he said, you described initial NWA screening criteria for grid needs. Can you describe those NWA screening criteria a bit more?
Yeah, the NWA screening criteria is based on a number of criteria. One is that a non-wires alternative would actually work. So, for instance, things like the projects, if it's a load-based, a load growth-based project, then using a non-wires alternative that would reduce load would work. If it's a reliability or infrastructure-based project, then reducing load doesn't help those types of projects. So the first screening for us is the project type. Other things that weigh into the screening would be the timing of the need. If the timing is too short for a non-wires alternative to be stood up and effective, or the need was too severe, it might not meet the criteria, screening criteria for a non-wires alternative. Likewise, if the solution was relatively low cost and small, again, it wouldn't meet the screening criteria, because to stand up a non-wires alternative takes, what would you call, time, effort, and money to be able to stand those up, and you want to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze.
Okay, great. Next question was from Joshua Gilbard, and it was, is active management curtailment of DER resources considered when planning reliability, or are they considered to be uncontrollable like most loads are?
For distribution sited resources, or resources that are typically interconnected on our distribution system, for the most part, these are considered what you might call firm resources and on off. So they're not directly, how would you say, dispatched or given dispatch signals. And until we actually, I think, turn the corner, at least that's what we're thinking at Central Hudson, until we turn the corner on being able to operate the system, or unless they're related to, in some instances, a non-wires alternative where they become, say, under contract, we have the ability to dispatch them. We consider them pretty much just on or off. And for the purpose of distribution planning, we consider them to be on. If it's storage, charging, and discharging, or if it's renewable resources like solar, we consider them to be on and at full output for our planning purposes.
Yeah, and this is Jason. I just wanted to add a little bit more to that. We are actually actively talking about the curtailment of DER in the ITWG efforts. We had a presentation from NYSEG, Avangrid, as far as their efforts, their pilot project efforts. And at our next ITWG meeting in May, we're going to be hearing from National Grid on their pilot program efforts for curtailment practices. So we are looking into that more, and we hope that it's going to be an option in the toolbox going forward in the near future. Let's see, the next question was from Kat, and it is, in the distribution planning process today, how and when do the utilities assess the DERQ to identify short-term needs? How do you consider long-term needs, considering the DERQ today is rather short-term? And then the second part question of that question is, can you expand generally on how utilities look at qualifying DER hosting capacity benefits today as part of the BCA?
So I'll start with the Q. We do take a look at the Q as part of the granular forecast. In other words, we use the Q to help inform specifically the location and size of distributed energy resources in that queue. But we don't stop there, because as you say, the queue is kind of short term, and it doesn't go maybe far enough out, nor does it even come close to meeting the levels for the CLCPA. So in addition, we'll take a look at what we may call a forecast methodology and scenarios to assess non-Q potential DER. And this becomes a little more speculative. We use the Q to try to inform it, where this DER may show up and when they may show up and how much might show up. And we also use other methods to try to assess whether it'll be rooftop solar or community solar or somewhere in between, to really get a good assessment as to how this might play out. And we'll run some scenarios as well. So all of those will end up feeding into the granular forecasts. And that's kind of how we get DER and unnamed, unqueued forecasted DER into our forecasts. And I do apologize. The second part of the question.
Sorry, it says, can you expand generally on how do the utilities quantify DER/hosting capacity benefits today as part of the BCA?
So I think in general, we look at it more on a qualitative basis for improving hosting capacity rather than a quantitative direct BCA basis. At least that's how we've been doing it, and we've labeled them as multi-value projects and use that basis. This is probably something that we'll need to, as the CLCPA and Accelerated Renewables Act has us doing more proactive investment, we'll have to take a more refined approach going forward, I suspect, on how the evaluation of improved hosting capacity can be more directly input into the distribution planning solutions.
Okay.
And I'll offer it out to any of the other joint utilities who want to weigh in there.
Okay, hearing none. Next question is from Jim Skillman, and I think it has to do with the example that you had gave John from Central Hudson. Was the 13 MVA transformer upgraded to 22 MVA to allow for more export through the transformer? Not quite seeing how more DER, which serves local load, requires a larger transformer unless power is pushing back through it. Or was the DER BESS, which is partly a load and partly a generator?
Yeah, it really was intended to be able to be for the times when necessary to be able to push DER and power back onto the transmission system, which is not unusual, but it can become from time to time the limiting factor on the installation of DER on a distribution circuit is its ability to push back onto the transmission system when required.
Okay. Next, we have Bill Acker. He's asked, how many load growth and DER scenarios do you typically create? Please describe how you then assess potential solutions with the multiple scenarios.
So for Central Hudson, we use actually a number of scenarios, and for our load forecasting and DER forecasting, we'll actually use a more probabilistic approach for that. That allows us to do a multitude of potential combinations and scenarios. But then to take it and apply it to the planning process, we need to assess both the kind of the breadth of the load impacts on the system as well as the probability of the load impacts on the system. So we'll actually set a marker to say if it's above a certain number of or percent of the overall scenarios result in identification of the need and the timing of that need. We kind of have that two-prong approach, both need and timing. We'll use that to develop the timing and need of a solution. So it's a probabilistic forecast that's brought into to help define the need and the timing of the need. And I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you.
And I do know that other utilities use different methods. Some use multiple scenarios or what you might call stress scenarios to help identify the needs and the probability of those needs. So there are different ways to perform the forecasts that don't necessarily involve probabilistic. They can involve scenarios and combinations of scenarios.
Thank you. Next is from Armit Sai. How far does your DER forecast go out to, and how do you incorporate policy changes in your DER forecast? Is there a plan to utilize any specific forecasting tool?
We typically have our forecasts commensurate with our load forecast, which is a 5 and 10 year forecast, a 5-year forecast at a what I'll call a more granular and more refined basis, and a 10-year forecast on a broader basis. I don't know that we're considering at this point using different models, although the question of how regulations impact forecasts is a great question. And it kind of runs even beyond DER, whether you're talking electric vehicles, building electrification loads, distributed energy resources, storage. All of these are being influenced by changes in regulation and these goals. I think prior to this point, we were using what we might call best estimate forecasts based on historic and trends, and I think going forward we'll need to have a lot more of the regulatory or regulation influenced forecasts as either scenarios or pressure tests to ensure that we are staying aligned with CLCPA goals.
Okay. Next one is from James Brew. Please distinguish or explain the difference between distribution planning, local transmission planning, and bulk transmission planning.
Yeah, so distribution system planning primarily focuses on the thermal and voltage limits related to your distribution system from the substation on down to the customer, and the models that might be associated with those distribution systems. So, many use like SIME type models or models that are specifically geared towards distribution systems and system planning. For distribution systems, because it's a radial system and not expected to operate at, say, pre-contingency, post-contingency levels of reliability and things like that, it is a different and in many ways a more straightforward model. Once you get into local transmission or bulk transmission planning, you're at a different level. For local transmission planning, it's pretty similar to bulk transmission planning, but it's with the purpose of the facilities that are, say, owned and operated by your transmission owners today. So those planning methods, Chris Schramm is going to go in extraordinary detail on, and he'll answer the questions on local and bulk transmission planning and those processes in a few short minutes.
Okay. Next is from Carlos. Do you know if the distribution planning process feeds into the transmission planning process? The location and size of DERs may impact flows on the transmission system, as well as there could be potential interactions between inverter-based resources when penetration is high.
So yes, the distribution planning process and the local transmission and even the bulk transmission are all relying on what we'll call similar forecasts, integrated forecasts. So when we develop a granular forecast for our distribution plan, it's the same granular forecast for us that would feed into our local transmission plan. And then we'll work with the NYSO to make sure that the local transmission plan and planning forecast is aligned with their bulk transmission forecast as much as possible. The integrated forecast approach is really key in making sure that if you're looking at scenarios or citing needs that that you're using the same loads for the same areas or distributed energy queue resources for the same areas to make sure that you are capturing just that, which is the impacts of distribution cited DER on the local transmission system and then eventually to the bulk transmission system.
Okay. Next question is from Pamela. And when building out load forecasts and scenarios, is targeted active outreach for new large loads such as MHDV fleets being included in the planning process? How does load management such as managed charging fit into the planning process?
So yeah, there's a couple of questions.
Or if Pamela can explain better.
No, I get it. There's a couple of questions built in there. It started with large lump loads, and then it's kind of snuck into electric vehicles. So I'll kind of handle it in both ways. So the first and foremost, large lump loads for at least known known projects are incorporated into the forecast on a pretty granular basis. So we kind of know the timing, we kind of know the size estimated, and so those are brought directly into the forecast and typically done outside of the trending forecast. Things like electric vehicles, because it's such a nascent program at this point, lump loads associated with, say, DC fast chargers or even medium and heavy-duty vehicle are still being done for us at Central Hudson on a trended basis. We'll continue to work to refine those forecasts as more information becomes available, whether it's planning that's done, say, through the NEVI process, the National Electric Vehicle Interstate Highway process, or even when we begin to get a better sense for how electrification will grow, we'll start to build more and more of those loads with certainty and with, say, better granularity. But right now, for the most part, our electric vehicle forecasts are done based on vehicle penetration and expected impacts on our system.
Okay, and I'm going to just probably allow one or two more from the chat box, and then just kind of open it up to the phone a little bit. If we don't get to all the questions right now, I do think we'll have time after the transmission discussion Q&A to maybe come back to some of these if needed. But let's just get one or two more in from the chat box, and then we'll go to the phone. I think this was more of a comment from Kat saying, thanks for answering the question. I expect the DER forecast methodology is one area where the stakeholders would like to provide input in future revisions of the process. So I think that's more of a comment and input into the processes going forward. And then I'm going to go down to, and then Liz Gazzaro had a question as far as how does the PSC's recent cost-sharing order impact distribution planning?
So up to this point, the cost-sharing order hasn't necessarily impacted planning. It's very recent. There's two aspects to this that I see. One is that projects that are related to the cost-sharing process will likely be included as part of what we'll call known solutions within our distribution planning process. And these projects that are identified as part of the cost sharing are typically going to be more related to the interconnection process than necessarily the planning process. However, there is some aspects, just like I showed with the Coxsackie transformer, where we will be assessing, as we do today, we will be assessing when we are replacing a transformer or a substation, assessing the size of those facilities as they're being proposed as a solution, and assessing it based on the potential for DER in those areas. And if the right now the cost share 2.0 process says if you've got these solutions planned in your distribution planning process, you'll offer them up as a potential for upgrade or uprate as part of the cost share 2.0. So it's more like the 2.0 is more related to what I would say the interconnection process and offering it up as a potential for upgrade through the interconnection process than necessarily the direct distribution planning process.
Okay, let's do one last one from the chat box from Christopher Casey. What other time frames used in the scenarios for evaluating short-term and long-term needs?
That's a good question. For me, typically, a short-term need is something that can be addressed within the 5-year capital forecast, and a longer-term need would be beyond the 5-year capital forecast. So typically, in the 5-year window or beyond the 5-year window.
Okay, great. So now I'd like to offer up anybody on the phone that wasn't able to join the WebEx. Are there any people on the phone that have questions for John or the JU on the distribution planning process? No. Okay, great. So why don't we, if you don't mind, John, why don't we do, we've got a couple more. Let's, if we hit maybe one more, and then we'll start the transmission section, if that's all right.
Yep, no issue.
Okay. So the next question I've got is from Mark Richardson. It looks like it's a two-parter. At what point is circuit voltage, thermal capacity considered as a companion to transformer upgrades in the planning process? Once the transformer bank is made larger, the limiting element then becomes the circuit hosting capacity. So simply making the transformer bigger doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Agreed. The circuit voltage and the thermal capability is a limit in and of itself. So you can't just drop back to the transformer. But those limits are typically addressed more in what I would call the direct interconnection process rather than the individual planning process. So for instance, a particular DER might want to locate on the circuit, and it would result in a circuit rebuild because just due to that particular DER's interconnection process. From a planning perspective, what we look at is more on a broader basis of the overall impact of the DER in combination with load and in combination with its ability to, say, backfeed up through the transformer onto the transmission system. So it's more of a step up outside of the interconnection process that we concern ourselves more with the distribution planning process. And I hope that answers the question.
Then the second part are our local land use policies, zoning, tax policy, et cetera, taken into consideration when prioritizing DG grid planning?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a direct input, but what we primarily for us, we use a sense for where DER are showing up in the queue as part of our forecast. So in other words, if we've got a lot of applications or applications in those areas, we're using more of a direct, say, extrapolation of that information than necessarily the local, say, planning or environmental rules. I think going forward, we are going to get better access as that information is built out. We'll have better access to that information to give us a better refinement on our DER, say how we're allocating our DER and DER growth on the grid. And I'll let some of the other JU weigh in there because I do know that that varies amongst the joint utilities.
Anything from the other JUs?
This is Jared from Con Ed. I think that's a good description from John. I think we would agree with that as well.
Okay, thank you. John, I'll leave it up to you. I have 3 more questions in the queue here in the chat box. We can either try to get through those and then you'd be done, or we can move to the transmission section. I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, no, we can. I know Chris is chomping at the bit, but yeah, we can. I'll take a couple more questions and see if we can finish.
Okay, you're doing a great job. You haven't had to use a lifeline yet.
No.
All right, so the next one is from Chris W. Are there improvements envisioned to the integration of system operational control between distribution and a local transmission?
I think at this point for the distribution planning process, there's not a big piece of it directly, but there are, you know, as far as Central Hudson goes, we are in the midst of our grid modernization project, and that will contemplate, moving from what I'll call a run as designed system, or what I used to like to call the ROM-POPEL, set it and forget it type distribution system, to a more operating distribution system. And obviously, once you begin operating and have visibility into your distribution system operations, the natural progression is to refine the interaction between distribution operations and transmission operations. The distribution system will now more inform even how transmission system might operate. So I do see those refinements taking place. We may be a few years away from that, but that is the natural progression that we're contemplating at Central Hudson.
Okay, one from Alan Michaels. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but from your slides, I understand bulk solutions should be considered. However, you said a holistic approach is not necessary. How will bulk solutions be reviewed if there's no holistic approach?
So thank you, Alan. We're not really talking about a non-integrated approach. What we're really talking about is more that we don't have to have a singular model that starts at that does the load flows of our bulk system, and then also does the load flows of our entire local transmission system, and also does the load flows of our distribution system. Different models and different focuses can be done, but the integration of the proposed solutions and ensuring that those solutions are working together and result in meeting the needs of both the bulk, local, and distribution system is still key. I don't describe that as a holistic approach. I describe that as an integrated approach.
Okay, and lastly, we had a second question from Danny Wagner. Referring back to your description of the NWA screening criteria, can you explain how a grid need might be reliability related but not load related? Is it mainly to resolve a contingency?
Yeah, so a reliability related need might be, say, we've got a pocket of poverty where a particular feeder or section of our circuit has experienced a number of interruptions related to either the route of, the condition of, or even the design and age of that particular feeder. Those reliability issues could result in what we'll call a pocket of poverty, or an unacceptable level of interruptions on a circuit that could be addressed by rebuilding a section of the circuit, providing additional tie points, reconfiguring the circuit to shorten the overall circuit length, or moving sections of circuit that have run through, say, what used to be a farmer's field is now a treed area onto the highway so that it's less subject to issues. Those are all the types of reliability projects that we might that might come from our distribution planning process that really aren't suitable for a non-wires alternative.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate all your time and effort, John. You did a great job going through all the questions and with the presentation. So if there are any other questions that do come up on the distribution part of the presentation, we can, if we have time, jump back to those at the end of our overall session. But for now, again, I'd like to thank John for his time and efforts, and then we're going to transition over to the transmission part.
Yeah, thank you, John and Jason. So good morning. I'm Chris Schramm. I'm a planning engineer at Atwg, and I'm going to bring you through a high-level overview of what the transmission process and what criteria we use in the state of New York. So transmission planners have to balance different studies and analyses in parallel while abiding by established study cycles. Each of these studies have different objectives and oftentimes separate criteria that are specific to them. Some examples of analyses are reliability studies, economic analysis, public policy, interconnection, and operational studies. These studies are developed to comply with requirements from NERC, NPCC, New York State Reliability Council, the NISO, and as well as local criteria that are required by individual utilities. Generally, each study will have multiple scenarios that are tested with different load forecasts, project inclusion rules, generator dispatches, as well as different interface stresses. This diagram here is meant to show how these analyses are cyclical in nature and how our studies feed into the NISO process. So starting from the top, planning analyses are based on data that's taken from NISO-maintained databases. These studies then identify needs and constraints. From these constraints, we then develop solutions and formalize a corrective action plan. This corrective action plan is then presented to other transmission owners and utilities as well as stakeholders. They are then added to the NISO Gold Book as firm, and finally the project is then added to the NISO database with a planned in-service date. And from there, the process begins again. So it's very cyclical, and the database feeds into the analysis, and the resulting projects from the analysis feeds into the database. Now I'd like to give a high-level overview of what is done in a reliability analysis. So this is a type of analysis that has historically been a significant driver of transmission upgrades and also produces a large number of projects. So a reliability analysis on the bulk power system or the bulk electrical system has limited variance between utilities, as there's regional criteria that we have to adhere to. So these studies are subject to a comprehensive N-1 and N-1 analysis. And what I mean by that is N-1 is a single contingency or fault occurring, while an N-1 is a contingency followed by a second contingency occurring. So utilities have to share their contingency events with other transmission owners so that all potential events are covered. This is done with coordination with the NISO. So for example, Atwg will, even though we're only studying our area, we would run contingencies that are located in National Grid or Con Ed or Central Hudson's service territory as well. So some utilities also have subtransmission, which is typically not subject to regional requirements. So there can be a lot more variability between operating companies. Some companies may even place the subtransmission planning process under the purview of distribution planning. Reliability analysis on these networks are usually less stringent than they would be on the bulk transmission networks, and usually only require an N-1 level analysis. So when we were performing these studies, what kind of scenarios are we looking at? What are our base case assumptions? we look at multiple load levels, such as peak, shoulder, or light load, and we can also look at winter load levels that might also be limiting in some areas. We also have to study multiple different years to look at different types of topologies and projects that might be in service. So we could look at a single year out, 2 years out, and 5 years out, and also long term, we might also look at 10 years out. We also develop different generator dispatches and adjust interfaces to produce a plethora of scenarios that could potentially occur. These cases are considered credible potential cases that could reasonably occur, but they're also sufficiently conservative so that we look at all possible system conditions, reasonable system conditions. So to perform these studies, we have to use multiple different powerful tools, which are different than those typically used for distribution planning. We use these to create our base cases and also rapidly perform our contingency analysis, which, as you can imagine, can be hundreds or even, thousands of contingencies that we have to run. So some examples of software are PSSE or Terra. So while performing these types of analysis, any facility that we find that falls outside of required reliability limits would be identified as a need. So during these studies, we can also redispatch or curtail generation to try to alleviate those needs. But if the issue is not rectified, then at that point, we would have to create a corrective action plan or develop a project to solve the issue. If we find that the project work is significant enough, a system impact study might also have to be performed to ensure that the project doesn't adversely affect the system. Another important analysis that's regularly performed is the interconnection process for large-scale generation that's based on an ISO-Q. So this analysis is of applicable generation interconnections that are listed in the NISO-Q and is typically performed by the NISO itself in compliance with tariffs and manuals, the tariff and manuals. In these analyses, the generator must not deteriorate the reliability of the system, meaning that facilities have to remain within the applicable reliability limits, similar to a reliability study. The effective utilities where these generators are interconnecting have to provide input for these studies, and upon completion, usually review the results. Utilities also assist in providing cost estimates for any identified new or upgraded facilities that might be identified. So this could be anything from a simple terminal upgrade all the way up to new lines or new substations. In these studies, generation may be allowed to redispatch or be curtailed in order to maintain the reliability of the system. These studies are also typically reactive rather than proactive, meaning that they respond to the interconnection requests rather than create headroom on the system before the requests come in advance. Again, this is discussing the large-scale generation interconnection process. Okay, so we've discussed the existing processes, general methodology, and results, but what's the typical timeline? So first, all these studies are cyclical in nature, and usually these are regulated cycles that have to be complied with. So depending on the scope of the analysis, there can be a large amount of turnaround variance between each of the studies. Some studies can be relatively quick, on the order of weeks, while others can take months. Even after a study is complete, though, the resulting project will require further development before it's even ready for execution. So this flowchart diagram that's here shows like a general idea of what a project needs to go through before it's ready for execution. So following this timeline, execution can take many years before it's ready. A project can take many years before it's ready. So first, as we discussed, a needs assessment is performed. This could be a reliability needs assessment, but another type of needs assessment could also be used here. So after that needs assessment is completed, a conceptual electrical solution is developed. Usually there's more than one. There can be multiple alternatives. And as mentioned, getting to this point could take months. So the projects that are then created conceptually are then put through a feasibility assessment to determine if what's been designed is physically feasible or physically viable. Once that physical assessment is completed, a utility might perform a comprehensive needs assessment. So, for example, if a station rebuild or a station upgrade was identified, there might be additional asset condition needs or distribution needs that would also need to be addressed at the station. And that is usually done in a comprehensive solution is developed. So once this comprehensive needs assessment is complete, a preferred solution or final solution is selected, and at that point it goes for typically internal and external project approval. So internal approval can vary between utilities, but external approval usually need approval from the NPCC, the NISO, and the DPS as well. Only after all of these steps can a project be considered ready for execution and put into our local system plan and capital forecast. So again, this whole process can take years for a project to come to fruition after a need's identified. So within these processes, how do we coordinate with what's happening on the distribution level? So I'm going to focus a little bit here more on the DER, but this is true for all distribution considerations typically. So the distribution system is typically treated as a load model in our transmission base cases, which includes any DER that might be present downstream, and that would usually simply reduce the load that's seen at the station. However, recently, some areas have needed discrete modeling of DER as generation to properly identify their impact due to generation outsizing the load, causing it to backseat on the transmission and subtransmission. Additionally, there can be clusters of DER that can become concentrated in an area. So there are also emerging concerns of potential stability risks if they aren't studied as a group. So besides this potential stability risk, what are some constraints that might be found in the transmission due to DER? Well, DER backfeeding, as mentioned, can result in thermal overloads, but can also cause high and low voltages to occur. This is obviously more prevalent when looking at the aggregate of DER at multiple stations within a small load area. Small relative to the transmission, that is. If system loading and voltages fall outside acceptable limits, it might even be possible that large-scale renewables have to be curtailed to resolve violations, as the DER isn't as easily controllable. This can potentially result in a situation where the DER and large-scale renewables could be competing for the same transmission headroom. So far, I've discussed a couple of the existing processes, but I haven't really touched on the Cgpp and why we feel it's needed. The reason we feel that a supplemental process is needed is due to the significant amount of deliverability constraints we're finding due to our renewable goals. Typically, the most attractive locations for renewables are the most remote and weakest areas of the system where there's a lot less transmission capacity. This high amount of generation can cause congestion that results in thermal overloads, but can also cause high voltage, low voltage, and in extreme cases, voltage collapse. So what's missing from the existing process? Well, the existing process allows full generation curtailment to solve violations, but there are a few studies that identify upgrades to ensure full deliverability. These studies are not focused on unlocking generation interest by increasing available local headroom. Developers also don't have a great indication of which regions are already oversubscribed and which areas have lots of available headroom. So this diagram here is just a high-level depiction of where there's a lot of large-scale renewable interest on the system, which is pretty much everywhere, honestly. So here's showing a similar diagram to the one I showed previously, but with a few supplemental analyses added in. So we envision our Cgpp process being complementary to an already existing analysis and not as a replacement for anything. We also hope to still closely coordinate with the NISO on everything involving the Cgpp. So the Cgpp will facilitate the identification and development of local public policy projects to meet CLCPA goals. It'll closely be coordinated with bulk, local, and distribution planning processes. Again, we want this to be supplemental to the reliability studies, not replace them. We also want to make sure that there's an adoption of similar set of assumptions across utilities to make sure that the results are consistent so that they can be easily digested by outside stakeholders. The system should also be planned out to efficiently create headroom to accommodate future renewables in areas of high developer interests, which we feel is a more proactive approach. We also hope to ensure that DER is properly reported and modeled, allowing consideration of upstream constraints on the distribution hosting capacity. Finally, we believe that communicating the available headroom within a specific local pocket will help developers identify the best locations and support the state in reaching its renewable goals. The last thing I wanted to touch on is how we want to utilize advanced technologies and the Advanced Technologies Working Group to help us achieve these goals of the CLCPA. So the ATWG is a joint utility working group set up so that we can coordinate and share information and best practices on a number of technologies that could help with unlocking renewable congestion. This group is working with NYSERDA, NYSO, and EPRI to determine best practices and use cases for emerging technologies. After identifying this tech, the ATWG will then communicate this knowledge with planners on what technologies can be used as a new tool in their tool belt. So some technologies that are on our radar so far include energy storage, DLR, power flow control, and also DERMS. But there's sure to be more to follow later as well. So that concludes my high-level presentation on transmission planning. And at this time, I would take any questions, as well as if I can't answer any, I would push those as well to the other TOs involved in the joint utilities.
All right. Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate that presentation. I'm going to, again, as we did with the distribution section, just kind of go through the comments that have the comments and questions that have come in and attack them on a one-by-one basis. So the first question is from Aaron Hogan, and will you please give examples of the software tools used in the analysis?
Sure, yeah. So we use Avangrid at least, and this is, I'm fairly sure, consistent across all New York utilities. We use PSSE, which is a Siemens power flow software. That's usually used for base case setup and visualization of power flow. We also use PowerGem's Terra for rapid contingency analysis. As I mentioned, we run hundreds or thousands of faults at once when we're running an analysis. We also use other tools like Aspen's OneLiner, which is used for short circuit analysis and other types of analysis for protection and controls. I'm not sure if other utilities, if you want to chime in, if you have other software I'm not mentioning here.
Anything from the other JUs? Hearing none. Okay. Next question is from Sam. Can you confirm if the definition for sub-transmission 100 kV, I believe, is consistent across the utilities, or does it change?
Yeah, so it's actually not as strict as what we previously, when we showed that previous drawing. It can vary across utilities. At Avangrid specifically, our sub-transmission is between 100 kV and 30 kV. Usually our sub-transmission is either 46 kilovolts or 34.5 kilovolts. I'm sure Con Ed has much higher voltages that they would consider sub-transmission due to their higher load density.
Yeah, and just this is Jason. I know from my experience with the utilities, the sub-transmission voltages can definitely vary from utility to utility. So it's not a consistent range, I would say. Next question is from Carlos. Does the New York ISO interconnection process feed into the transmission planning process? The New York ISO interconnection queue shows where developers are interested in connecting the projects and would help to be proactive in identifying solutions in the transmission plan.
Yeah, so we definitely include queue projects that are beyond a certain level of study that's been done by the New York ISO. That's actually put into their databases that we use oftentimes if they're considered quote-unquote firm projects. And then we will have to develop solutions that may or may not have been identified in the interconnection process. We also might look at that queue and do our own sensitivities. Say a project might not be considered firm to be included in a released base case by an ISO, but as a utility, we might also say, well, there's a lot of interest here. Let's take a look and see if there's anything that might occur. So yes, to answer your question, we definitely consider the New York ISO interconnection and queue when we do our transmission planning analyses.
Okay. Next question is from Hillary. With distribution planning, a screening process for NWA was described. Will a similar process where grid enhancing technologies like DLR be implemented to get a grid enhanced technology where a get could be evaluated in the transmission planning process and directly compared against traditional upgrades / investments? This was suggested in a February 2022 report from DOE that focused on New York and CLCPA goals. I guess it was called Grid Enhancing Technologies, a case study on ratepayer impact.
Yeah, so at Atwg, we certainly look at NWAs over traditional wire solutions. And specifically to CLCPA, we developed this advanced technology working group specifically to look at how they can help unlock renewables on the grid. And the goal of that working group is actually to identify different grid enhancing technologies like DLR, like power flow control, and how they can help planners develop solutions in a more cost-effective manner in order to unlock all these renewables and reach the state's goals.
And just to add a little bit more, I mean, that the Advanced Technology Working Group right now is working towards, their plan to be filed with the Commission in July of 2022. That was kind of their initiative task to them from the Commission back in the January order, is to develop a plan for how advanced technologies will be implemented going forward, and that's kind of what the group has been working on to date, is coming up with that plan and developing the details for their submission to the Commission in July. Next question is from Radhika, and how is the interaction between transmission planning studies and results in the market, and ultimately what facilities end up being secured in the market engine, for which condition N-0 or N-1? If there are overloads on local facilities for N-0 or N-1, what criteria are being used for determining if an upgrade should be proposed?
So I have not performed myself a market study. However, when we're looking at deliverability, we're usually looking at N-0 and N-1. As far as what kind of violations we would have to solve, It's usually thermal, but we can also see low voltages that we'd have to look at. I don't know if there's someone else that can answer that question better.
Anything from the other JUs?
Hey Chris, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid. I think when we talk with our system operators at National Grid, generally it's important to realize that our entire network system is generally secured by our system operators, and they look at N-1, N-0, and N-1 conditions, right? So even if a facility isn't secured by the NISO in their market software, it is secured by our National Grid system operators. Now, the only exception might be, radial facilities, and there is some flexibility there for us to consider securing those, but really that's like an N-0 type security analysis, and then it gets pretty simple, but, it is something that we've been discussing is radial facilities that aren't included today and whether they would be in the future or not.
Anything else from any of the other JUs? No. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question, Radhika. Next question is from Bill Acker, and how will stakeholders have visibility to and input into the Advanced Technology Working Group efforts?
Jason, it's Liz. Do you want me to take a crack at that one?
Sure.
So, Bill, as Jason said a minute ago, the first sort of public thing that is going to happen is the July filing, where we should see the group's plan for how they're going to accomplish the various goals the Commission gave them. So I think that's, one marker to keep in mind. If I recall correctly, the order directed the utilities to talk to a lot of people in putting together their plan. So we'll see what comes out in July and go from there.
And I can add a little bit more. We have expressed our interest as far as from DPS to ensure that there is visibility into the working group efforts as far as hearing from either vendors or whoever it may be from outside parties, and not just keeping it internal to the JUs. So we have expressed that, and I believe they should be planning to incorporate those efforts into the process going forward. I don't know if there's anyone from the JU that wants to respond. Okay. Next question is from Seth. And procedurally, how does the Cgpp overlap with or not the Pptn solicitation process? And I'm not sure what the Pptn is, but maybe.
Okay, so this is Liz Grizzaro again. I'll take this one. It comes up a lot. People ask this question a lot. We expect the Cgpp to provide the Commission an overview of system needs across the system, including bulk system needs. And so we expect, and the Commission has said in its recent orders, that it will continue to rely on the NISO Order 1000 process to identify bulk solutions as they are needed. So the Cgpp will give the Commission the overview of how the system is evolving, where the needs are appearing, and the Commission will continue to ask the NISO to use the Pptn process to identify cost-effective solutions going forward. So that's the answer.
Thanks, Liz.
Great. Next question is from Kat. In order to deal with the integration/coordination challenges for transmission and distribution planning and the inclusion of significant level of inverter-based generation, do you envision changing your modeling approach? Have you considered how complexity may impact timing to perform the Cgpp? For example, we have seen utilities start to build out very complex and time-sensitive PSCAD models to model transmission impacts of DERs that have taken a substantial time to perform.
Yeah, so I can speak this a little bit. You know, as I mentioned, we're starting to explicitly model the DER on the system to see if there's any upstream needs on the sub-transmission or even transmission. It's something that we're at Avangrid currently trying to work through to try to anticipate where this DER might be coming. Because as I mentioned before, in timelines, it can take weeks or to actually get to that needs level and make sure that we're good with what we're seeing. So our hope is the Cgpp will help us get a better indication of where those upstream needs might appear.
Does that answer your question, Kat?
So sorry for the super wordy question. I'm not going to type any more in the chat. I guess it does. Is it, you know, like, I guess one of the things that lots of folks have asked about and are concerned about in New York, because it's occurred in other regions, is the impact of kind of transmission level studies for clusters of DER. So is it envisioned that the local transmission process with, you know, kind of the new requirements envisioned in the Cgpp is going to be proactively responsive to that? So you're looking in advance for those transmission impacts versus dealing with them when they arrive in the queue.
Yeah, so I know for Avangrid in some of our phase 2 of our analysis, which is sort of pre-Cgpp, but we're going to look at it later. We are looking at the potential of backfeeding in certain areas causing constraints and developing solutions to create headroom prior to us reaching those high levels of DER penetration. So I think that answers your question. Yes, we are going to try to be anticipating creating headroom prior to generation interconnecting. And I think that includes DER, at least for Avangrid.
So that, are you thinking about that specifically from like a thermal headroom perspective, or are you also thinking about like how to account for those voltage, you know, potential voltage impacts of DER? Are those both embedded into that framework?
Yes, yeah, we'll be looking at both thermal and voltage. As I, you know, just off the top of my head, we have been seeing, you know, some thermal needs or thermal and voltage needs just from backfeeding on our sub-transmission.
Great, thank you.
And I think it's worth noting that this is not supplanting the interconnection process at the various TOs or at the New York ISO. It is proactive, but we're trying to build the track in front of the train, so to speak. So we're doing our best to create the headroom that's going to facilitate this transition, but the interconnection process remains the same, but should be dramatically simplified and streamlined relative to the existing process.
Great. Next question is from Dave. Is there a point of contact within the Atwg, the Advanced Technology Working Group, for advanced transmission technology providers to contact and present their technologies?
So I can send something out, and maybe Con Ed, you can help me out here, but King Luke is the chair, I believe, of the Atwg. I don't know if someone at Con Ed wants to maybe send out his information for that specific request.
Yeah, and what I was going to say, you're right. King is the chair of the group, and I would expect that there would be a process and contact information in place as far as, once they file their report in July to identify how that should be done going forward. Okay, got a couple questions from Paul. How is FERC Order 881 being factored into how the grid will function in real time versus how the system is planned? And how do utilities determine if a bulk solution might be a more efficient solution to a local transmission system need?
Well, with regards to 881, that is more of a question for the New York ISO. We are not getting into operational studies or market-based studies here. So I think I would defer an answer on 881 in particular. And then what was the second part of that?
How do utilities determine if a bulk solution might be a more efficient solution to a local transmission system need?
Sure. And the Cgpp still needs to be worked on, but that is something that was factored into the framework that the utilities put together. So in the process that we proposed, it still needs to be finalized, there is in sort of the middle towards the end of the process, we have our local solutions, and then we pair those in with the bulk solutions that come out of the New York ISO process that may also serve a sort of a joint benefit, or maybe could replace some of the local projects or vice versa. So there is a coordination, and that's one of the key benefits of the process that we're trying to lay out. So that was the long answer. The short answer is we are factoring those bulk solutions in, and the end result is the least cost solution.
And I'll just mention, I mean, if as far as the the stakeholders on the call, if I read your question and the response from the JU, if you still have clarifying point, feel free to just jump in. Just keeping in mind that we do want to keep moving through, but I don't want to just say that I'm the only one that can read your question or respond to your question. So with that, so next question is from Bill Acker. How does the present planning process treat projects that could be built in stages so that it has more flexibility to optimally serve different future scenarios?
So when we perform an analysis, we usually do it, as I mentioned, by study year. So if a project is done in stages, they would have different in-service dates. So we would be looking at the project as it is in, say, 2 years, and then look at it as it is in 5 years, and see if that resolves all the needs that it was meant to resolve. Specifically for, say, a large-scale renewable, we would do it in a similar way and identify whether or not if there's needs in 2 years out versus 5 years out with the larger amount of generation.
This is Bill, could I follow up on that?
Go ahead, Bill.
Sure.
Yeah. So Chris, so I guess what I was interested in particularly is, if you do a number of different scenarios for 5 to 10 years out, and one scenario has a much higher need than another scenario. If you have one project that puts in place the higher need, and you have another project that's at the same cost that could do it in 2 steps, so you could wait and then see if the higher scenario occurs, and if the lower scenario occurred, you don't need the second step. Obviously, there's a lot more value in that second project if it's at the same cost. And I'm just trying to understand whether our present study systems would capture that.
So I can't really.
A lot more detail that needs to get fleshed out and exactly how the process will function. I can say that historically, we have tried to identify projects that function in that way, where if there's a phased approach that either is the same price or it is not materially more expensive, but provides that flexibility to right-size your solution, that's absolutely something that we would expect the benefit cost analysis could capture. But the way that it would actually function would have to be determined as we move through our implementation process, the development process, to be honest.
Okay, so is that something that you're going to develop, that methodology of how you will do that study as part of what you're going to be filing for the CCGP?
I don't think at this point we're in a position to speak to specifics, but the development of the Cgpp will be a collaborative process.
Thanks.
Okay, next question is from Carlos. If a generation developer that is in the New York ISO interconnection process proposes a grid enhancing technology today, such as DLR or power flow control as an alternative to traditional upgrade or to solve potential congestion, will the New York ISO and the utilities consider it as a potential solution? Are there any current technical barriers for the immediate implementation of DLR, power flow control, or other grid enhanced technologies?
So that is something that the Advanced Technologies Working Group is certainly going to be exploring. Power flow control is something that's used today, and it's something we've considered in some of our other projects for CLCPA. Dynamic line ratings is sort of tying back to my question, or the previous question on 881. Remains to be seen how that's going to be implemented in the region. It would be hard to roll that out in just the Cgpp. There's a lot of moving parts on that, and how 881, in particular dynamic line ratings, it tends to be more of an operational feature. I lack clarity on how that could be rolled out to planning studies. So yes, it's more of a wait and see on dynamic line ratings in particular, at least at Avangrid. I can't speak for the other TOs on how they may want to account for that in local planning studies. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
And again, I know, DLR and power flow control, those were specifically identified by the commission for the ATWG group to kind of tackle first. They're not the only by any means, but there was considerable interest in them from the last report from the utilities last year on those as being some of the higher priority efforts. So they were identified by the commission, and I think that's what the group is going to be focusing on those first as part of their efforts.
Thank you. This is Carlos. Yeah, I think that on the planning side, I think that we could probably consider to add DLR probably in the light load cases, where when the wind is blowing really hard, the line ratings are going to be higher, and in the light load cases, you basically have a lot of wind in the dispatch and basically no solar. So we could probably consider, or it could probably be considered to have in the planning process, including DLRs, at least in the light load cases, to mitigate the need for additional upgrades.
Yeah, and I just want to just level set a little bit here. So there's some jargon, so at the risk of getting a little technical here. Dynamic line ratings has a very specific meaning for folks in the transmission space. So those are truly like minute by minute ratings, and really only apply in the operational space, even within Order 881. To the extent that we implement ambient adjusted ratings, which are more of a medium term rating, or enhanced seasonal ratings, where we're not just stuck with winter or summer ratings, where we maybe have these overnight or spring ratings. Those are not in place at the moment. That's something that the Advanced Technologies Working Group is certainly going to look at. But I want to be careful with how we discuss dynamic line readings in particular, because that's not likely something that's going to directly impact planning studies. But there are ways that we can account for the operational flexibility that dynamic line readings affords to our system operators to develop planning scenarios that are more appropriate for the future of the grid.
Okay, great. Last question we have in the chat is from Radhika. And when looking at the transmission needs of the local system, are you typically looking at higher voltage alternatives as well?
Yeah, so we look at any reasonably cost alternatives. So typically, if we're looking at a higher voltage solution, it's because an area is remote and requires a new source in there. Usually the higher voltage, when you go to higher voltages though, the costs increase. So we'll consider multiple alternatives, including higher voltage alternatives, but we'll have to make sure that the economics of it makes sense in order to consider that type of solution.
Okay, great. So again, that's the end of the questions that we have right now in the chat. I'm going to open it up to anybody that wasn't able to join on the WebEx that is just on the phone. Are there any questions out there from the phone for the transmission guys? Okay, hearing none. It seems like everyone was able to join the WebEx. That's good.
Jason, it's Liz. Are there, just to close the loop, are there folks on the phone who had distribution planning questions that we weren't able to get to?
Still hearing none? Okay. All right, I think I had one open question from the distribution that came in the chat right at the end, and I'm just gonna go up to that quickly. So I don't know if John is still available, hopefully, and it was
still here.
Great. That's from Chris Casey. And how are emission reductions and impact on disadvantaged communities considered in distribution planning?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I do know that we take into account those factors in program implementation, such as the implementation of our energy efficiency and electric vehicle programs. But I don't have a good answer as to whether there's other ways in which those aspects are brought into our distribution planning process. I can't think of any other ways other than through the implementation of our electrification programs or our electric vehicle programs. And I'll open it up to see if any of the other joint utilities have aspects of their planning process that they know of that bring in these aspects to their plans.
This is Jared from Con Ed. I think you covered it, John. I think the only item I might add from Con Edison's perspective is, we do include those as line items in our network up, forecasting process. So those are factored in, the proliferation of EV technology, and then the success that we've had and the continued success that we will have with the EE. Those are items that we factor in as growth items as a modifier to our forecasting efforts.
Anything else from any of the other JUs on that? Okay. So again, that's all the questions that we had through the chat, and we talked about phone. Any last questions before we kind of wrap up and have some closing remarks today for the JUs on their presentations, either D or T? No? Okay. Well, again, I would really like to, extend my appreciation and thank you to the JU, John, Chris, and all the other participants in today's presentations. I think they went pretty well. I had a lot of good conversation and as far as a lot of questions, so that was great. I think we've mentioned earlier that there'll be more meetings and opportunities for stakeholder input on the overall CLCPA and Cgpp efforts going forward. I know I'm tasked with kind of following with the distribution discussions, and I do plan to reach out and set up a specific distribution stakeholder session in the coming weeks to talk more about any other specific concerns, either from DERs or anybody else on the distribution system, and we'll be reaching out with information on that in the near future. Liz, I believe there's some other meetings that are coming up from the overall process, and if you could talk to those.
Just briefly, we are currently working with the utility. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. We're working with the utilities, NISO, NYSERDA, to set up the next technical conference in this series. And the focus of that discussion will be, how do these, we've talked about the planning at distribution, local transmission, bulk levels. So the next conference will focus on what are the existing planning cycles? How well do they line up? And could they align better to support the overall CLCPA objectives? So that'll be our next topic, and you will see notices go out from us as we pin down the date and time for that event. But it'll be in the first half of May. And there will be, as Jason said in the opening, there'll be a series of these tech conferences over the next several months, and we look forward to seeing all of you again.
Great, and I just wanted to mention again that these slides from today's presentation I believe they are posted on the DPS website, and the link is here in the actual notice that went out to the public underneath the case number 20-E-0197. And again, this session was recorded, and we'll be putting that recording up there as well for anyone that would like to review that. And I think overall that kind of concludes our efforts today. Again, just want to appreciate and thank the JU and everyone's time today. And we'll be putting out more communications on the next steps for going forward. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.